Welcome back. Thank you all for being here this morning. Thanks to especially to those of you who traveled some distance to be with us. We've got a second panel this morning. It will proceed, kind of be somewhat similar in tone and to the first one. We've got a slightly different set of questions because we've got a wonderful group of panelists that have a slightly different set of expertise. So I will just kind of give one-sentence introductions. They will be horrifically partial because they're all deeply accomplished scholars, but just for the sake of getting right into it, we'll keep it brief. Starting here, Amber Wudich is a Regents Professor, President's Professor, Director of the Center for Global Health, and a MacArthur Fellow here at ASU. Second is Chris Jones, who's an Associate Professor of History in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at ASU. And then next is Manu Lal, who is the Director of the Water Institute at the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory at ASU. And finally, to your left is Anthony Acciavati, who is the Diana Balmori Associate Professor at Yale University. He's also a Fellow of the American Academy in Rome and a Senior Fellow at the American Institute of Indian Studies. So thank you all for joining us and very much looking forward to the conversation. So just to sort of start it off in a similar way that the first panel did, can you give us a story or moment that exemplifies the problems with water? Can we kind of start with you, Amber?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. As you may know, I have been directing the Arizona Water for All initiative, which Dr. Patrick Thompson on the first panel also talked about. So I'm going to shift and give a little different perspective on the work that we do. One of the things we're concerned about is Arizona's most water insecure populations. So just to give a little glimpse of who those people are and how they come to be water insecure, water insecurity at the individual and household level is usually socially constructed. There's something happening in the social systems that gets people there. So the housing crisis and the housing affordability crisis, which has pushed people into homelessness, is one example of how people become water insecure. They don't have secure access to piped water, and so throughout their day, they may or may not be able to get enough water to drink or bathe or for household use. Another example is people who work in outdoor labor, particularly during our summer months. The scarcity of water available for laborers is a serious pressure point. And the final example is our very own students here at ASU. We have done some research indicating that those, for example, staying in Best and Irish Hall, which I hear are slated for demolition, have experienced occasional water insecurity because they have communal bathrooms. So they don't have 24-hour access to water, unlike those who have shared bathrooms between the rooms. So these just give us little glimpses of ways that the social and economic systems that people find themselves located in push themselves here in Arizona into temporary but significant water insecurity.
Excellent. I'm a little bit of an outlier because I'm much more of a energy infrastructure and economic growth person than a water person in general, but I've been really interested in thinking about what are the logics of ever increasing need for energy, for growth, and how does water fit into that or not. And as a little story, I just am back from a college reunion of a number too high that I don't wish to mention the number. And there was a sort of presentation by this university's very significant energy approach, energy institute, very large enterprise. And there's premises that I think are similar to water, that it needs to be for everyone, it needs to be cheap, and it needs to be abundant. And one of his points was, well, to make renewable energy competitive with others, we've got to get the price down. And the only way to get the price down is to produce huge amounts of it. And I'm wondering, I'm just sitting here listening, I'm like, do you see a potential contradiction in your terms here, right? That if our goal is to get to a sustainable place, we can't have the logic of ever more production, ever greater economies of scale so that it becomes cheaper and meets this. And so I'm curious to think some about how, in the domain of water, and the sort of infrastructure we need for it, which is maybe a theme we return to, how can we imagine sufficiency instead of ever increasing scale for ever lower cost as the sort of thing that is driving action, and this is not even driving it because it's capitalist corporations. This is a research university sort of embodying this logic as well. And so some of those contradictions I'm interested in thinking about.
Okay, so I'll work through the same strategy and give you an example. One of the things that got brought up in the last panel was the vanishing groundwater. There she is. And then if you talk to some of my colleagues, they will give you global pictures of vanishing groundwater and land subsidence and all of that comes with it. So we know this is happening. We know this is happening because people are taking out more water than goes into the ground. And the water that they are taking out typically is 1,000 to 10,000 years old. So this is not something that's going to come back. And that's the part that people don't often get. Sorry, your water is going to disappear. Yeah. So, when you look at the global scale, the most often cited problem causing the depletion is human activity. Humans want to use this for economic purposes, and agriculture is the most cited one. So in around 2008, or actually around 2006, we did screens of global water insecurity. And the country that popped up on top was India, and which is where I had come from, but had not been there for decades, right? So we started looking into that. And the point of my story is going to be this. It's an economic activity, but as an engineer, I'm interested in seeing how I can conserve water, because that's what everybody says. We need to use less water. So we did experiments with 12,000 farmers, longitudinal experiments for about 6 years continuously. And the idea was, can we get these people to test out a variety of different technologies in parallel with what they do to see what they will adopt? Notice it's not about the evaluation of the technology, but its acceptability, right? So as we were doing that, what we saw that was remarkable was in year one, we had around 70-75% happiness of the farmer with whatever technology we gave them, which were randomized across farmers. Okay. In year two, we were down to 35% of the people continuing to even participate formally in the experiment. In year three onwards, we were down to 10 or 15%. And when you ask them what happened, because your happiness levels were so high, they said, we don't really see a reason to do this. The electricity we use is free. The government wants to buy the total product that we produce at a fixed price, which is higher than the global price. Why would I change my behavior? There are snakes out there in the water. I have to go and look at these sensors and deal with these snakes. I was going, when did you last see a snake? But that was an interesting lesson. And in parallel, we were trying to work with the national government in India to see what we could do. And I was very much cued into the idea that giving the free water and electricity is not good. And paying these people so much to grow crops that do not belong in that place is not good. And you were hitting that point earlier. So we tried the idea of, could we bring in contract farming so that they could grow less water using crops and get paid more? Because it was very clear that the goal of the farmer, and these are subsistence farmers with small plots, is to make enough money to live. And you're not going to overcome that by any means, right? So that driver, it turns out, is interesting and challenging to implement, because the person who's going to offer that contract does not want to go to you and you and you. They want to send the truck here and just grab what they can from one individual. So in short, what it turns out is that to solve this original resource sustainability problem, what we really need is a design of a financial instrument or a market-based instrument that can actually address the specific needs of these people. So it's a community, but the community is not just that, because that community individually is incapable of solving that problem. So that's my main message, is to think about the fact that there is an outside world and there's the community, and it's the intersection of those two is what we really have to understand.
Well, and to piggyback on that, most of my work is in India, where I've been mapping the Ganges River Basin for some time, which is what brought me here to Arizona, actually. So For me, one of the issues is how we visualize groundwater as a constituent part of a shared set of resources that we have. And what brought me to Arizona was that here your territorial Supreme Court in 1898 had a case where someone claimed that they had a subterranean water flow and that their neighbors were taking out more water than previously, so they had a first in time, first in right argument about it. Effectively, your the territorial Supreme Court and the US Supreme Court upheld this, that water that quite literally, they said, oozes and percolates from the ground is a constituent part of private property and does not fall under surface water body regulation. So for me as an architect and a historian of science, this is a very fascinating issue of conventions of drawing. So how do we draw groundwater to understand that it is something as shared as the air we breathe that was discussed previously? And how do we bring it under kind of not only greater scrutiny, let's say, but how do we change people's understanding of it as a shared resource? This is important because that case that was here set the groundwork for work across much of the common law world. So Roman law was brought up before, but a third of the world operates under common law. So Barbados, Kenya, India observe very similar relationships to groundwater. So for me, part of this is also how do we start to visualize this and give people a sense that the depth of the earth that we're taking so much from is how we're terraforming the surface that we live on. And that for me is a challenge that dovetails with many of the comments that were just made.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm hearing that there's a sort of thread of structures, cultural structures, economic structures, the physical infrastructures by which we get water and electricity and so on, but also things like economics as a structure that impacts what's acceptable or not. So in thinking of that, maybe structure as both something built and physical, but also something that's sort of metaphysical in some sense. Maybe that at least feels to me like a lead into the second sort of topic of conversation, which is who should have a voice at the water table and how? So maybe just go in the same order?
Sure. Hi. I'm trained as an anthropologist, and in particular in a kind of anthropology that has been lovingly called dark anthropology. So the dark anthropology is the anthropology of the vulnerable, of injustice, and so forth. So this is a question that is very comfortable to me because getting a seat at the table for people whose voices are not heard was very much my goal 30 years ago to begin to train in dark anthropology, if you will. The issue is that 30 years ago, there was a water table because experts had the opportunity to solve climate change and to solve water problems and to create new structures that would better manage these issues. The trouble is that we missed the boat. We dropped the ball. We screwed the pooch. That window has closed. Experts no longer can solve this problem alone. That means that the relevant table is not the water table where experts pontificate and choose solutions, but rather the kitchen table where every household and every family is impacted by these problems. That means that the kinds of structures we're going to be looking at are decentralized, they're adaptive, they're small scale. Communities are going to bifurcate and not be cooperating to solve the problems. And so that means that instead of focusing on bringing people to a table and getting them to a seat, we need to go out as experts to all of those kitchen tables and communities, offer our resources, offer our expertise, uplift and support them. Here at ASU, we have the Arizona Water for All Network, which is a step toward building those relationships for vulnerable communities so that they can empower and manage themselves. Dr. Carol Jordow at the back is the director of that network, and you could talk to her after about how we're doing that work. But I think we really need to shift our focus to how we get out to those kitchen tables and support the people who will be suffering as a result of this failure on our parts.
You know, I think that I would just build on what you said, and I love this sort of 2 liters plus 50, and maybe thinking of an analogy from economics, right? I mean, the people who are powerful have a seat at the table, so we don't have to worry about that. They're going to be there. They're going to fight tooth and nail for what they have. The question is, how do those without the power get something there, and what are our approaches to it? So it's like, and I wonder, just riffing, I haven't really thought this through, but I'm ambivalent about it, but there's a concept in economics called universal basic income, which is basically this idea that who knows what employment is going to be if all of these AI things go as they are. We're going to have huge numbers of people who are not necessarily employed, and the idea is maybe we need a social safety net that says, here's what you need to live on, and we ensure everyone gets that, or there will be mass chaos. And there's deep problems with this in other ways, but what if part of whatever the water table had, there was a move to say there's a universal water, not income, so I don't know the term, someone else can pioneer the human right to water, but that essentially that was the first tranche of water. That like before anything else is discussed, that is set aside and mechanisms are developed to deliver that, and then everything else is fought over, the sort of extent of which we do that. I don't have the implementation mechanism for that, but sometimes maybe there's a sort of concept like that that can be linked to some level of quantification that can just say, what if that's the first tranche?
Okay, so I'll preface
Idealistic.
what I've got to say by saying that I always agree with Amber, so we just endorse that as a +1 right off. Agua Mesa, right? That's what you're asking about. So let's think about it. When Amber said dark anthropology, I thought she was going to talk about the future, and I was going to shut up immediately. But you know, I think before we talk about who's at the water table, we ought to be thinking about what are our processes for discussion and solutions about any issues that we face as societies, and where are we going with that? Because these are never static, despite the long history. There's always an evolution in how these ideas are used. And I think to pick up on what Amber was saying, we may be at a point where there are going to be significant structural changes in how that works. Some of them are scary, so I'll not go there. Again, jumping back to India, and this is something I learned 2 years ago at a conference at Princeton, which was shocking to me. I always think of India as lagging, because that's what you're conditioned to do. However, there's an area in which decentralized governance is emerging in India, which is remarkable, so I will talk about that. This individual who talked to me and gave the talk at Princeton, works at the Indian Institute of Information Technology, so it's the AI world, so to speak. What they have developed in India is called a digital public infrastructure. What it is that every single individual in India has a digital ID. The ownership of all information pertaining to that individual belongs to that individual. So if you go and get medical records, the doctor does not own it. You own it, and you can share it with any doctor or any individual at will. Going beyond that, so that's at the individual level. At the larger scale, that individual can now digitally interact using their $30 cell phone with any other individual in the entire country of 1.4 billion people. Think about that. Okay. Moreover, things that we are talking about as data, because that was brought up in the previous panel also, we need a website. Instead of a website, if you want information on the state of your groundwater or other things, the design is you can pull that up on your phone with the level of specificity you want, and no one will know that you actually did that. But think about how this now translates into community potential for community activity. 5 people get together, they can examine the information you were talking about and actually discuss it in their specific context rather than in Aqua Mesa somewhere hypothetically. This is a possible good. Unfortunately, things that are possible goods don't always manifest in that way and are dark, but the hope is there.
Well, I think speaking about processes, structural change, I'm reminded of, I was at a conversation with the second in command at Alibaba before they took away Jack Ma, and I think this person, and he was saying he's much more interested not in how technology changes society, but how people change technologies. And I think to that end, the people who are really shaping so much of the way in which we're going to structure ourselves around the environment where governments are not doing this are actuarial scientists. So the insurance companies in this country and around the world are developing models that are not just kind of climate focused on year long, but 30-year amortization mortgages are being factored into this. So they're going to be the ones that are really actually shaping de facto not only where we build, but how we live. Because if you can be insured or not, especially in parts of the world where you have insurance in abundance. So I think for us sitting at a table like this, it's imperative that we both be kind of mediators between the people at the kitchen table of the Aqua Mesa, but also having a better sense of who these people are that are de facto shaping and using these models, because I do think that that's where we stand a chance of having an ability to intervene and shape not only the discourse, but hopefully hallucinate on practices that can be done within that prevailing model.
Thank you for that. A final question from me, and then we'll open it up to the audience. What changes should be made to water infrastructure to meet future challenges?
So one important thing I think that scholars can do is bring a different perspective to a problem that everyone is mulling over, and I love how everyone on this panel does that. I've always wondered about actuarial science and why it didn't have a bigger seat at the table, for example. And so one perspective that I like to bring is the perspective of archaeology. So from archaeology, we have 200,000 years of human history understanding how humans respond to climate change and how they survive. And one of the things that we know is that a basic response is migration, decentralization, less large-scale market exchange, less identity formation that has to do with cosmopolitanism and more focus on the local. So one way that we can look to the future is to begin to plan for the kinds of infrastructural changes that human history tell us we should probably anticipate, which is more decentralized, more localized, self-organization when facing a climate crisis. And so for that reason, here at ASU, we have led the creation of a new field of research called Modular Adaptive Decentralized or MAD water distribution. The origin of this is actually in Paul Westerhoff's work in engineering around creating these small engineered systems, and the realization in my group that these small engineered systems for creating small-scale water security tend to be deployed only through the market, which is the social system least accessible to the poor and vulnerable. And so we brought our groups together to create social systems that are available to people that are poor and vulnerable that can obtain and maintain these MAD water solutions. So an example of that would be from the work on the border. We know that people who are experiencing water insecurity, of course they rely on the market, but they rely very, very heavily on family structures, right? So how can we build ways that people can deploy these small-scale engineered water systems that are integrated with and rely on the family structures that are already people's first line of defense under water insecurity? So that's an example of the way that our group, which is very closely aligned with the Water Institute and the work that Manu's doing, is thinking about the future and how we can use science and community-based participatory research to build to a more secure future for the most vulnerable communities.
I want to just riff on insurance because I can't help but mention, I'm glad you brought it up. You know, it is one of the interesting things that, and I had not thought about what it means for them to not insure now shaping it. I remember 10 years ago a lot more optimism that maybe these will be the capitalists that will care most about climate change because they are exposed to the problem and have a big exposure, and maybe they would use their collective weight in a good way to say maybe we should pause this, and they largely did not. And the logic is actually what they've done is they're like, we write one-year policies, so we just renew a little bit less each year of our most vulnerable regions, and that's how, so instead of being at all proactive to solve the problem, they are just sort of year by year thinning their place with assuming there's enough market for them to still go there. And so it was a disappointment that they could not be on the positive side of doing this, although I appreciate you bringing it up because I have not thought through what it means for the lack of insurance to exist and how that will reshape society over time. On this question of infrastructure, as a historian of infrastructure, one of the biggest takeaways I've seen is that infrastructure gets used. This is a basic truism, but people tend to use infrastructure to the max of its capacity. So whatever infrastructure we build for water, we can expect that to be used. And so we had one set of use in Arizona before the Central Arizona project, or am I saying that right? When we brought all of that from the Colorado River to make new things possible in Phoenix, and we live in Phoenix in new ways now because that infrastructure choice was made to bring a certain amount of water to make certain things possible. Obviously, there's these sort of talks about, are we going to build the same thing from the Great Lakes? And I'm actually not convinced we won't down the road. But whatever infrastructure we build, I think we can assume that people will use to that capacity. And I think this provides an opportunity, at least when we're thinking about it, to say, what is the size of infrastructure that we want that fits actual social needs for water use, and the size of infrastructure that says we actually can't go beyond this? Can we use infrastructure to set that limits of some sort in some way to say beyond this we can't have that infinite growth? This is our cap, and maybe we can build that in a little bit of a new way.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll frame it this way. It's not really a question about infrastructure. It's a question about the aspirations of individuals and society. What is it that you really want to have? And once you define that, we can build the infrastructure to achieve that. Specifically, let's look at a couple of things. Much of the infrastructure, the aspirations are very simple. You want clean water, but you don't want to be drinking poison when you open the tap, right? And I met a farmer at a EPA meeting representing the National Farmers Association, and he was scoffing at the EPA regulators, and his claim was, I live on the land, I hunt and fish, I get in the river, you are telling me that I'm polluting and I'm not concerned about it? How wrong you are, right? And so I'm going to hit the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act, which we encoded as our aspirations as a society, to which then we need to build the infrastructure to respond to. Between 1973-74, when those acts were passed, and 1985, we had dramatic improvements in human and ecological health. However, the last 40 years are a completely different story. It's the story of failing infrastructure across the country, increasing violations of drinking water systems, exponentially increasing failure to report violations by public utilities. And on the Clean Water Act side, EPA data that is abysmal. The concentrations of chemicals recorded in water bodies are physically impossible in most of these data sets. And then if you filter all that out and look at what comes out, we are worse now than we were in 1985, except, remarkably, in red states, which is very puzzling, right? Florida, which is where you're from. And the answer to that, it turns out, is that those states were so bad that they could improve. Okay, so what I'm getting at is that now if we talk about what infrastructure we would build, I think we need to restate our aspirations, because clearly those legislations have failed. We talk about PFAS, we talk about microplastics and nanoplastics. The fact that we talk about those is clear evidence without going through data that we have failed with those. So what infrastructure are we going to build? Is it going to be at the micro level that Amber is suggesting? Yes, I want something in my kitchen that I really do not want to trust anybody. The trust issue is big. As you talk to people, the number one thing that comes up is I do not trust the providers anymore. They trust bottled water. He brought that up earlier also, right? What is the definition of the infrastructure and the architecture of the infrastructure? It's not about the technology. It's about the things that I'm talking about.
I would say, as someone who has studied kind of the impacts of decentralization, because in many ways the bore well and the tube well were celebrated as instruments, technologies for decentralization so that people could take charge of their water. But like most things that are successful produce more problems than failure, I would say. So one of the issues with this is that while it's allowed billions of people to thrive for drinking, it also creates all kinds of unintended and perverse consequences, which is also the bread and butter of historians, to study those things. And I think for me, one of the aspects that gets lost when things become so decentralized is then this question of trust becomes a huge issue. So I have direct access to it, but then there's all of these other things that start to impact it, say with groundwater or surface water, the air we breathe. But I think that one of the things that gets lost then, and I'll speak about this more in the context of South Asia, we have these incredible infrastructures there known as baulis or step wells that were ways of catching rainwater, connecting them to aquifers during the monsoon season that many people survived on, but these tube wells and bore wells replaced them in many ways. And one of the things that are very powerful about aqueducts, qanats, and step wells is that they give a civic presence to water infrastructure. So I think for me, one of the challenges that we have today from the scale of architecture and urban planning is, well, how do we transform water into a public good and a public space through architectural and urban form? And that to me is one of the challenges, not to go back to step wells, baulis, but instead, what does that mean in the 21st century of how do we build a civic identity and a cultural identity, going back to your very astute question earlier for the first panel, how do we do that? And I think that's something that requires obviously lots of different people coming together to synthesize those aspirations to give a civic identity to water, but also then has a kind of cascading and other set of effects that can happen.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I'd like to open it up to others. I believe, is this the only microphone that we have to pass around?
No, I have another one back here.
Okay. So if you would speak into the microphone, it's for the folks online. So if you have, I've got several questions that I'm happy to ask, but I imagine others of you might also have issues to raise. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'm curious about your thoughts on the rise of data centers and a reliance on artificial intelligence and just like the increasing reliance on technology and how that's impacting the systems of water and the ways water are used.
Can people asking questions introduce themselves?
Oh, yeah. Could you just maybe give a one-sentence like bio of yourself?
I'm Jay Knight. I am an MFA student doing interdisciplinary work around water.
Okay, great. Thanks.
I can take a swing. I'll warm up. Well, one thing when we look at human history that's very interesting is when there is a serious, like a mega drought or a serious water stress, we usually see people dispersing and changes to the economy that make it less concentrated. So what's quite interesting about the strategy of the data centers here in Arizona, for example, is that they are betting on growing the economy by pulling in more money and pulling in more people, and that is going to create a sustainable future for our water scarcity problems. So as an anthropologist, I find that to be a very interesting case. Excited to see how it turns out. What do others think?
Go ahead.
I mean, I think that, there's journalists have been looking at the ways and say Meta's data centers are causing taps nearby to go dry. So I certainly think that connection between how maybe data centers and AI are going to be using more water than Coca-Cola takes out of the ground for their sweetened beverages. I think that's part of a larger kind of network of issues that surround the ways in which we're so attached to water. But I think that's just one of many I think a constellation of issues surrounding water. I can't give much of a better issue with that other than, again, I think these are some of the perverse and unintended things that happen with our increasing reliance on data centers for storing things, and that they're obviously not in the cloud. They're quite grounded and embedded as resources.
I think your point about that, where are the social values in this? Like, what is the future? It has been so broadly accepted that economic growth is good and is an essential that the questions of what type of economic growth, for what reasons, and in what manner is so rarely asked. And I just look at AI and like, what are the likely scenarios of AI It makes a whole bunch of money for a few elite companies, like a few elite engineers, even though many are pushed out, and early capitalists are going to make a lot of money, and it's going to push a whole bunch of jobs out. So we're going to have higher GDP, but we're going to have higher unemployment, dissatisfaction. We're going to use huge amounts of water, cause a lot of social problems for communities, problems for the environment, but GDP will go up, yay. And I think that there's still too much blind acceptance that pushing for that GDP growth justifies it, and that one of the biggest things we need to do is ask, what is growth for whom and who's actually participating in it? Because I see very few scenarios where the growth that comes along with AI is a benefit for anything more than 2 to 3% of the population, and that collective resources are going to go into this is extremely worrying to me.
Okay, so I'll react to your comment first and then go on. I think there's a misconception that the GDP will actually go up. Incomes, maybe, but there's no product here. It's a virtual product, so there's not a real product that you're producing, most likely. But beyond that, from a water perspective, because that's what you're really asking about, I think that this is a ripoff. There is no such thing. And the reason I say that is that right now, as he said, there's a spectrum of investors who are funding separate groups to do various things. Each of those groups is going and training a model on exactly the same data, or largely highly overlapping data sets. The game here is that, again, you alluded to that, a small subset of those people will survive, the rest will go away. Okay. How many data centers do we need in the world? Every country, every state, including the Arctic, is being explored for putting these stupid data centers up, right? Now, what's most interesting is how they're doing it. So let's say I'm OpenAI or Microsoft or whatever. Am I putting the $50 billion into that data center myself? The answer is no. What they're doing is they're asking some third party to build a data center, and they will lease it for 5 years. This is called a bubble. Okay? So that's one thing that is in the making. The other thing is that in terms of the water aspects more specifically, most of the early ones were using evaporative cooling. Mm-hmm. That is where the drain comes from. The minute they were questioned, they started going to a little bit more closed loop cooling, which uses about 5 to 10% of the water that the evaporative cooling was using. Why didn't they do this to begin with? Hey, it's cheaper. Nobody's charging me for the water, right? So now that that issue's been raised, oh, okay, we did replenishment projects for the communities as an offset. They're not listening. So we better go to the next one. Frankly, if they really wanted to just reject all the heat that they are generating, they could do ground-based heat pumps, inject, do a circular loop with the deep aquifer. There's a higher capital cost. Obviously, the guy doesn't want to do that, but the water use is near zero associated with that game. So they can go there if they want to.
Yeah, please, in the back.
Hi, I'm Christy Spackman. What am I? Associate Professor of Art and Science here at ASU. The weird things that happen once you get promoted and you can't remember you did. I am so intrigued by the tension between, Amber, what you brought up about the modular water systems, and Anthony, what you brought up around the idea of civic infrastructure for water. Because I can imagine these modular systems at a slightly larger scale being a form of small-scale civic infrastructure that bring people together, just like our colleague talked about in the Rio Verde foothills with the well. And yet at the same time, they also potentially when you move it towards a largely urban population, it potentially disempowers or further disempowers the opportunity for people to come together around a civic infrastructure like a utility. So how do we think through the tensions of maintaining, or the issues of maintaining the current infrastructures we have and trying to build a community that thinks together about water versus this also very individualized requirement in a rural community that's underserved to have access, or even in underserved portions of our communities to feel like your water is safe?
Thank you for that question. I'll just give you a slate a tiny little vision of the journey of how I got to this really maligned and unpopular place that I'm in right now. So when I started working on water 30 years ago, everyone was like, everyone's going to get piped water service. It's going to be amazing. We all just need to stay with the Millennium Development Goals. We're on track. Right? But because I do community-based participatory research and I go out to communities who are not on track and are not getting piped water, and they're frankly never going to get piped water in the lifetimes I'm talking to, I just couldn't keep lying to them. And so I had to listen to, okay, well, what are you doing that's working, and tell us what that looks like. And so I'd go back then to water policymakers and say, well, this is what it looks like is going to be happening for these people in their lifetimes. They're like, we're not going to talk about that. Everything's on track. I'm like, it doesn't feel on track. Right? And so 30 years pass and it becomes increasingly obvious that it's not on track. So this mad water agenda is not something that we advocate for or we're excited about. It is us trying to create a backstop against the crisis that these communities, who in those days I was working in Cochabamba, Bolivia, but now we're talking about communities here in Arizona. So this is a creeping, growing problem. So the agenda that we have is first, identify people who have safe water and are likely to have it in the future, and then try to reverse their withdrawal from centralized water systems, because, was it Manu, you were the one saying? People are just pulling off these water systems because they don't trust them, right? But they're perfectly safe. Then there are people who are not in perfectly safe water systems, that the water can be used safely in some ways. Let's try to work with people so they can understand it's safe to bathe, it's safe to create a garden, but maybe it's not great to drink it. You need water treatment, you need bottled water. And then finally, for people who are never going to get piped centralized water systems, how can they create these mad water systems so that they exist? Now, at the same time that the groups I work with are trying to address this crisis of withdrawal from centralized water systems and not getting centralized water systems, my beloved colleagues who deeply disagree with me on an ethical level believe the only thing we should be doing is trying to save the centralized systems we have, expand them, grow them, get everybody on them. That is a highly ethically defensive position, and they need to keep running toward it. So the idea that we could create, water monuments that make people want to do that, I'm so inspired by that. I live in Tempe. I love having piped water. It's amazing. I wish everyone could have it, but that's not the world we're living in right now. So I think that those two things need to be working in tandem, with respect and caution about the benefits and drawbacks of each approach.
I would say that there's a kind of middle scale that gets lost here a lot of times when it comes to this. So on the one hand, I look at how, bore wells, tube wells were celebrated as this kind of bottom-up solution, and obviously not everybody had access to them, and they were very different than a highly centralized system like the Arizona, the kind of Colorado River networks you have here, or the Ganges Canal system in India. And so I think there's a kind of middle scale where these two processes or scales come together, and that's a scale where I think, to speak to what Amber's mentioning, and I think others here have mentioned, that to me is where we have an opportunity to bring the very big and the very small together in conversation. So I think what constitutes civic monumentality depends upon who we're talking with and where we're talking about this. So I think it's, on the one hand, how do you start to create a sense of a constellation of things that are in relationship to one another? And it's not so much a technological succession. It's a little bit more like when we look up at the stars, new constellations show up, and it doesn't mean that they outshine the others. It's that they're all kind of more in conversation. And I think that that's also something that we want to think about too, when these systems of centralized, decentralized, with many things in between, how do these things come together and overlap, and where are there opportunities to give a civic and public sense of what those things are? And I think that just depends from place to place, group to group, and time to time. I know that's a kind of non-answer answer, but that's the best I can give.
I've got a question from an online participant that I'll read. It's from a retired environmental engineer, and it reads, getting control of our water situation requires politics, parentheses, sorry, and law, and not just water law, but water rights, water pricing structure, and who has power at the table. Humans are a crisis-driven species motivated by emotion, fear, belief, and are predatory politicians. So how do we navigate water policy? Who would like to take this one up?
You're throwing that to me.
I think so, Manu. Yeah, you take that one.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I'm going to respond to this in the following way. what I see when I get involved with people who are discussing that kind of a question more formally at the table that they end up at is they want to define lines around what exists today as rules, and they don't want to cross those lines but work within those. And I think that is actually a bigger problem, because if you can't visualize a brighter future, but you want to fight about how to modify the current situation through small perturbations, that doesn't work. And often, when you say something to them, they will say, "Oh, that's out of the box thinking, and we can't discuss that." That has to change, because especially this country was built on out of the box thinking. So how do you now come around and tell people that we are incrementalists? Yeah, I'll stop with that.
And to build on that, if the last 1, 5, or 9 years has taught us anything, the conditions of possibility in government are radically different. We are seeing change at a policy level, ideas that seemed off the table suddenly on the table. And there's a lot of opinions about whether this has been for the good or the bad, but an optimistic take around this is the notion that we have to be small and incremental and reasonable at every stage. That's not the style of American governance right now. There's very little that's small around this or incremental. And so I think one, if they wished to push that in different directions, might take some stock that we are actually at a moment where more could be imagined as feasible than perhaps 10 years ago.
I'll just piggyback on that unless somebody has something to say. I just got back from a national water strategy meeting at the Aspen Institute night before. And I heard this phrase repeatedly from people, before times, in the before times, like what was going on. And all I could think of was, this seems like Game of Thrones, But I pursued this, and it's exactly the sentiment you're expressing. Most of these people are liberal, left-leaning individuals at that kind of a meeting. And they are saying that what is going on by breaking down the entire US government has created an opportunity that is unprecedented to do something new, and that the Democrats were historically too scared to do this. And so this guy has done us a favor. I don't know. I'm not a politician. I don't follow politics, but I found it interesting that we are now thinking about 6 months ago was before times.
I think we've got, please go ahead. I'll just bring the mic over.
Sure. Oh, is there enough time? Yeah, just go ahead and listen. We're going to at 12 o'clock. Okay. 15 minutes from here.
Everyone's off the hook if you don't have anything to say about this, but I'm writing about it right now, and that's the future of what is sometimes called toilet-to-tap technology, but advanced water purification. And I wonder if you guys have any thoughts about this. And I'm especially interested about if you guys have any thoughts about the culture, because obviously it's a very kind of culturally involved idea, and it's an infrastructural idea that it's people's feelings and popular opinion is going to go a long way. But as a kind of a comment, I want to say I think that there's some hope in toilet to tap in making water more of a sacred thing, because when you realize the water you're using is going to get recycled right back to you, I think you start to understand it in a little bit different way. And it makes me think of the Yanga River, actually, where you use this water for everything, but also everything you do with that water is going to end up downstream for the next user. And I'm hoping that water recycling at the municipal wastewater level might create an ethic or a more deep appreciation for how we use and treat water.
I'll jump in there.
Sure.
And my apologies, I have a speaking engagement at 12, so after this I have to run to get to it across campus. I'm trained as a cultural anthropologist, so this is very much my comfort zone. And the thing about humans, I am a big believer that humans are very malleable, but there are some things about humans that are not malleable. They're storytellers, they're meaning makers, and they're prestige accumulators. So when you want humans to do a new thing, if you're not creating it in a way, and I don't mean brand changing, like change from one brand of toilet paper to another. No, they're using the toilet paper, like they're still locked into that pathway, right? But when you really want humans to make a big change, it has to be situated in culture in a way that's meaningful and offers a pathway toward prestige accumulation. And if it doesn't, forget about it, right? So for example, if you created a cult on the internet where people worshipped at drinking their own urine, and being a part of that cult was a vehicle toward prestige accumulation for those who belong, boom, it's gonna work, right? If you tell people that they're shamefully using too much water and they ought to cut it out, never gonna work, right? So it's all about the social construction of meaning and the prestige accumulation around the shifts that you want people to make towards sustainability, in my view as a culture anthropologist.
I'm gonna end with a cult of urine drinking.
Yes.
My own background's religious studies, so I feel like that this is an unexpected collaboration opportunity for all of us.
Get a YouTube channel.
But I want to thank, please join me in thanking the 4 panelists and the 4 previous ones as well for just a really wonderful morning of sharing from your different expertise, stories around it. And I think as Lindsay mentioned on the first panel, sort of helping us overcome this ability that we're kind of have, those of us who especially didn't grow up in Arizona or Phoenix, that we come here not really expecting to have to think about water, and you've given us a lot to think with around it. So thank you very much.